everybody. Hello and welcome to the International Conference on Transformative Education 2024. I am Bianca Chazer. I am the CEO and co-founder of the Big Sister Experience Down Under here in Australia. And I'm honoured to welcome you to this fireside chat this evening, or it's evening for me, it's today for you, with our guest, David Adams, where he will be discussing the future of SEL, balancing technology and human connection. But before we jump in, I'd like to welcome everyone from wherever, whatever corner of the globe you're dialing in from this evening. As I said, I'm down under here in Australia. David is in Chicago today. It's bright and early for David. During this session, as I said, we'll be hearing from David. David is the CEO of the Urban Assembly and was part of the creation team of the Resilient Scholars Program, RSP, which is now a national program across the USA, integrating social and emotional learning into curriculum and classrooms. David is a co-founder of International SEL Day, sits on the board of KSEL, and is an author of The Educator's Practical Guide to Emotional Intelligence and co-author of the textbook Challenges to Integrating Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Programs in Organizations. He's a civil affairs officer in the Army Reserve and holds an MEd in educational psychology from Fordham University. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I feel David will be a wealth of knowledge on this subject. So David, just to start us off, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your organization and your program? We'd love to kind of get a real solid understanding of who you are and your background.
Well, Bianca, it is a pleasure to be here this morning. It is early, but it's not quite bright because I'm here before the sun comes up in Chicago. I'm actually from New York. The Urban Assembly is an organization, a nonprofit that has designed 22 schools. And now we design educational solutions in 3 areas: in social and emotional learning, post-secondary readiness, and instructional quality. So basically, we work with our schools to design these solutions, and then we scale them across our schools and all schools. So our work has impacted over the last 3 years about 1.5 million students across New York City and beyond. I'm really looking excited to think about what innovation looks like in public education. Now, a little bit about myself. You mentioned I've got 2 kids, Elijah and Isaiah. They're home in New York City. I have been married for 14 years to my beautiful wife, Tamika. As you mentioned, I'm an officer in the Army Reserve. And I'm really excited to be here with you today to talk a little bit about SEL, technology, and human connection.
Awesome. Thank you. Equally excited to be here with you. I can't get over, I think you said 1.5 million students impacted.
Yes.
That is just huge. Congratulations. That's huge.
Thank you. We've been thinking a lot about how to use technology to scale innovation. So it's a little bit about what we're going to talk about today.
Absolutely. So I've got a few questions for you. So I'm going to roll off the first one. So I want to talk a little bit about the role of technology in SEL integration. So as social and emotional learning becomes more integrated into educational systems, how do you see technology playing in a role in enhancing SEL outcomes while still ensuring that that human connection remains central to that learning experience? How do you balance it in your perspective?
Bianca, it's a great question. If you think about what we think about the pedagogies of social and emotional learning, is how do you learn social and emotional skills? How do you develop social and emotional competence? I want to make an analogy to a sport, maybe something like basketball or even baseball, right? So there are sub skills. Let's say in basketball, you have to learn how to dribble, you have to learn how to shoot, you have to learn how to rebound. But basketball isn't dribbling; it's not learning how to shoot or learning how to rebound. A great basketball player puts all those things together in a game. Right. And so social emotional learning is very similar to that. You have skills, things like active listening, eye contact, breathing, and you put those skills together. And then you get a competency like self-management. And then you apply that competency. Students demonstrate the ability to manage their emotions, right? Across these conditions of stress or emotionality where you need to actually demonstrate that competency, that skill. So one of the challenges in these social emotional skill development, just like in basketball, is practice. So
Mm.
in basketball, you might practice shooting a free throw with your coach, and if you miss, everybody has to run because you're trying to recreate some of the stress of playing the basketball game, right? In social emotional skill development, when we learn the skills, we often do them in kind of neutral environments, right? Where there's not a lot of stress on them, we're taking in information. But then we need to apply the skill. We're actually doing it typically in a lot more stressful situations. So let me just give you one more example. If you're learning to use iMessages, you maybe learn it in the classroom, but when you're actually deploying iMessages, for me, I'm like, to my wife, I'm feeling very frustrated. I'm disappointed that you're upset with me, but I am sorry about the work that I did or whatever the situation is, right? So the stress of the actual conflict resolution context can inhibit the activation of that skill. So balancing SEL in terms of technology means about applying SEL to the right things in terms of technology, practicing SEL skills with an agent who doesn't get upset with you, who doesn't get tired if you mess up, who doesn't necessarily have their own kind of things to say, can help prepare you to deploy that SEL skill when folks are actually stressed, when folks are actually under conditions of emotionality. And then when you're working with technology, applying and then generalizing that skill to real life allows you to practice a skill, practice then the generalization of that skill, so that when you and I are talking, Bianca, and I need to think about like active listening or paraphrasing, I know how to do it well, even under conditions of stress. So I would say, at the bottom line, practicing this skill is important, and technology can help us to practice that skill because typically we don't want to practice skills with people yelling at us. But when we're actually applying that skill, we need the actual friction of a real person because that
Mm.
is going to help us to develop the kind of competencies we need to pull out the right skill at the right time in the right situation.
Yes, so it sounds like quite a balance between creating that safe space to practice the skills, but also simulating that kind of tension or that kind of, you know, real life scenario.
Yeah, I'll use one more analogy. In the US, our teachers are often developed in student teacher programs, and they're often kind of taught the theory of education. But the theory of education and actual classroom are very two different things, right?
Yes.
So when you're working with your students and you're doing classroom management, you're activating SEL skills all the time. And sometimes your teachers are like, it's a very different experience to have to manage 30 young people across a classroom than it is to like learn about it, right? So you have declarative knowledge, what you know, and you have conditional knowledge, how to do what you know effectively. And in that conditional knowledge, the more practice you have under stress and emotionality, the easier it is to activate those skills when it matters.
Absolutely. And I really relate to that example. I actually used to be a classroom teacher myself. And I just feel like I came out of university full of confidence, stepped into
Yeah.
the classroom and had absolutely no idea what I was doing. So I really relate to that example. And
Yeah.
in terms of talking through the example that you've given, is there like an ideal age that you feel that we could come in to support with these practicing these skills? Like, what's your view on that?
Well, look, if we're doing our jobs well, we're practicing our social emotional skills throughout the day. If you think about kind of your infant, your baby to infant space, it's around 2.5 years that the juxtaposition of intent and a language starts to develop, right? So
Mm.
you talked about your children.
Mm.
So if you remember in 2.5 years, like babies want to do something, but they don't have the language. So you get a lot of tantrums, right?
Yes.
Because
Yes.
like I want something, but I have no language. And so the world is so stressful, right? And it's about
Mm.
3 years old, 4 years old, and you are probably co-regulating with your child, and you're just like, oh, I'm still gonna be all right. And then you're starting to kind of like help make the connections. For my son, I was like, Elijah, you're probably tired. And he's like, don't tell me how I'm feeling. And I'm like, but
Yes.
look, like notice that like when you get tired, you get kind of cranky. And it was like 5 years old, and he finally like put it together. And he's like, I'm going to bed, Dad. I'm going to bed.
Yeah.
So throughout our developmental kind of spectrum, right, these interactions drive the
Mm.
social and emotional skills that our young people are developing. naturally. So you have a natural trajectory of things that kind of develop, and then they develop through these interactions that kind of like unlock the next kind of pathway, right? Um, Social emotional learning and social emotional development is not unlike like vision development. It's like your brain is wired for it. But if you
Mm.
don't have the interactions that activate the kind of neural pathways, it doesn't actually develop effectively. So
Yeah.
I guess the long way of answering this, Bianca, is like we are always supporting the social emotional development of our young people. It's a question of how intentional we are about that support
Mm.
and how clear they are about the things that they're learning. We can always do it all the time.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. And again, I'm kind of going off script, but I'm curious to know, do you feel, I feel like SEL is kind of the last few years has become a really emerging conversation, and people are starting to recognize the importance of it and the importance of being intentional, as you just mentioned. Why do you think that has been the case over the last few years? And
Mm.
has technology played a role in us refocusing our intention on nurturing these skills?
That's another great question, Bianca. And there's a couple of things that happened. You and I were talking a little bit about the pandemic.
Mm.
And I think the pandemic forced us to kind of think through this notion of what is the purpose of public schools, right? Are they spaces to just transfer information, or are they spaces to nurture the whole child? Or is education about knowledge, or is education about development? And I
Mm.
think as I watched young people interact with their computer and Google Classrooms, uh, and we asked them like, what do they miss about schools? And I think you might be surprised that they did not say we missed algebra. They didn't say we missed calculus. They said we missed our teachers. They said they missed clubs. They missed their
Mm.
prom. They missed these markers of what it means to be an adult in our country. And so on the one hand, we see a really profound mental health impact of the pandemic still today, with behavioral challenges, with social emotional challenges, with mental health challenges, suicidality. But I think in a more fundamental sense, we are reimagining, particularly in the age of artificial intelligence, the role of the education system in developing the whole child. Um,
Mm.
when we have access to such depth of information so easily, the question of what we know versus what we do with what we know becomes more profound. Um,
Mm.
we know our societies need young people who can resolve conflict effectively, who can interact with themselves in the world, who can go and deal with ambiguous problem sets in the workforce. We
Mm.
know our communities do better when folks are able to see themselves as part of that community and contribute. We know our families do better when folks are in relationship with each other and are able to co-regulate, as we talked about with our children. And we would be remiss if our education system didn't take this opportunity to support the development of young people who can do all those things. So I would just challenge us to imagine who we could be if young people graduated being able to be, know, and do the things that we know are part and parcel of what it means to have a great functioning society.
Yeah, I love that. And that's so powerful. And I love the distinction that you made, asking, questioning our schools for, for learning, for knowledge or development. And I just love that concept of developing the whole child to thrive and flourish. And it excites me to think that there's humans like you out there doing this work to nurture these young people, and nurture these skills. It's exciting to think of the shift that could be happening over the next few years to refocus on this. SEL really. So another question I have for you in terms of challenges in scaling SEL programs, because a lot of school communities might be doing your program, they might be doing their own versions. So the Urban Assembly serves a diverse range of students across various urban settings. What are the key challenges you've encountered in scaling your program, especially when balancing technology-driven solutions with the need for those, as we said, authentic face-to-face interactions?
Oh boy, there's always challenges to scaling, Bianca. So we had participated in an opportunity to scale our SEL concepts across 1,600 schools in New York City.
Wow.
And that program was based on the work we had done in New York. And I will tell you, when we scaled the ideas, the behavior scaled more than the ideas did. So I'll give you an
Mm,
example. We spend time giving students feedback on their social emotional development because we know that feedback really matters in terms of having students take ownership of their learning, right? Um, but when we scaled the solution, a lot of our schools in New York were really focusing on assessing the kids, but not necessarily focusing on giving them feedback and setting goals around their development. So going back to our question, it became another kind of space to transfer knowledge or to assess as opposed to develop. And so that happens, uh, and the impact of that was that the emphasis was like, are we screening kids for social emotional challenges as opposed to developing students' social emotional outcomes? Um,
mm,
I worked really hard to kind of reframe some of the ways that we were thinking out in a larger space. Um, but it is a challenge. And again, I would say what people were doing, if you came to an urban assembly school and you went to another school, it looked similar. You know, you had students and they had an assessment and they were getting teachers to see how their self-management, but the intent was different.
mm,
So I find it hard to, I'm still struggling to think about how you scale intent, how
mm.
you create the structures and systems so that people understand what the idea is and then sync those behaviors to that idea, because behaviors are easier to measure than actual kind of concepts behind it. So we're still working
Yes.
on that. Happy to have kind of feedback from you or folks in the audience in terms of how to scale things at a level that allows us to really get at the idea behind them.
Yeah, well, definitely. If anyone's listening and has some thoughts on that, certainly feel free to pop your ideas in the chat box. But I think it's interesting bringing a concept focused on the whole child to a school setting, and somehow it still kind of channels into that old school mentality of, assessing and, instead of, as you said, developing feedback and having that interaction with the student.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about equity and
Mhm.
access in
Yeah.
SEL when we're talking about integrating technology. So, in your experience, how can schools ensure that all students, regardless of socioeconomic background or access to resources, how can all students benefit equally from SEL initiatives, especially as tech based solutions continue to emerge?
Mm. Yeah, I think this goes back to your question about scaling. You have to know what you're doing and why you're doing it. So, like, I
Mm,
am not a fan of replacing human interactions with technological interactions with regards to social emotional development, because we know from the research that what drives social emotional development is social and emotional learning in the context of interacting with people and ideas. And so I worry that because technology is easier to scale than high quality human interactions, they're going to default to a technological solution, which is easier as opposed to a human solution, which is more meaningful.
yes.
Um, we talked a little bit before about like your children in terms of seeing an iPad for the first time when they came to the United States and keeping them kind of
Mm,
engaged in a very long trip. Um,
yes.
and I see this a lot. I see folks um, when they're thinking about like how do I engage my young people, thinking about okay, like what are the different tools that we have to do so. And I mentioned to you when my kids came over to Australia, I was like, here's our Nintendo Switch. You got 24 hours. You can do it whatever you need, right? So there's intent behind the way that we thought about it. Um, and I want us to continue to think through that intent. As I mentioned before, there's some really good uses of technology for social emotional skill development.
Mm,
The idea of practicing discrete skills with an agent that is tireless and that's happy to give you feedback.
mm,
The idea of applying skills in the same way that playing sports is an application of social emotional skills, things like negotiation, conflict resolution, communication. Those are applied social emotional skills in sports. You can do the same thing in certain kind of technology spaces. Um, but I worry that if we are looking to create access, cost matters. And when
mm,
we look at how to scale in a way that manages cost across the range of social and economic need. Oftentimes, the solution for students in higher poverty areas is more technology, less high quality interactions. So, as we're thinking about the answer to your question, I would offer that we do need to prioritize high quality interactions. We need to prioritize the development of children's skills and their ability to practice those skills. And we can use
Yeah.
technology to supplement that process,
Mm.
but it shouldn't replace the person in the room.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think what keeps coming up in responses to your, to the questions this evening is just being really intentional with what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're doing it. That seems to be a bit of a theme that's emerging.
Yeah, the intentionality is everything, and it's the hardest thing to scale, Bianca. I think, as I said
Yes,
before, we can scale
yeah.
behaviors, but not always reasons.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'm mindful of the time. I would love those who are watching this conversation to pop in the chat box maybe your biggest key takeaway that David shared with us this evening, or your biggest takeaway from this conversation, while I pose the last question. And this is the one I'm most curious about, David. It's in regards to the future vision for SEL. So looking ahead, what is your vision for the future of SELs in schools? As technology continues to evolve, how do you feel we'll strike that balance? And yeah, just what's your future vision? What are you excited about?
Well, Bianca, I think the future of social and emotional learning is going to be a powerful one. In the age of artificial intelligence, we are already seeing a prioritization in businesses around things like collaboration, things like goal setting, um, things like initiative that are related to self-management, communication skills. If we think about what it takes to run a democracy, what it takes to solve problems big and small in our communities, that's the same kind of skills: building relationships, communicating effectively, seeing yourself as part of a whole. And I think as artificial intelligence reshapes how teaching and learning happen, we will start to think about even more deeply how are the social and emotional outcomes of our interactions prioritized? How do students think about who they are and who they want to be the world? And then how do we deliver young people to the world who are ready for their community, ready for post-secondary life, but also ready for things like careers and their families? So that's the vision of SEL. That's, I think, the responsibility of public education. And I'm excited to get to that vision today.
Yeah, I love that. And as I said earlier, that's something, these conversations excite me because I feel like we can always be doing better. And the more that we have these conversations, we might spark an idea, or, someone hears something that ignites something in someone. And we continue these conversations to support our young people to just be thriving, healthier humans with greater capacity for connection and problem solving and all of these things that we've been speaking to this evening. So is there anything else you want to leave us with, David? I'm mindful we've got a minute left.
Bianca, it's been a great pleasure speaking with you today, learning a little bit about your work, about your family. I'm excited to think about a global coalition of folks who are invested in the transformational power of education and SEL.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for your time, David. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We will wish you all the very best and have a good day to everyone.